So we'll go to Mr. Souza and then Mr. Backrack.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And to those that may be watching, it's, it is a sad situation when I look at the degree of mischaracterization, character assassination, certain of the insults that are being thrown around. Interestingly enough, some of those that are actually providing the insults are too skin thin to receive correction on their own part. Talk about red face and ego. It seems that there are members that are only considering their performance on a YouTube or a social media hit. And talk about being red face. I don't recall how you say that in French, but obviously some members opposite do not understand the ability for Canadians to utilize both languages officially in our country. And the leader of the opposition, who himself, we talk about transparency and accountability.
Point of order.
Sorry, Mr. Souza.
I've been rather patient with Mr. Souza and listened to about a minute and a half of non-relevant material. Can you ask the member to be relevant in his comments, please? Thank you.
And there you go, folks.
He does have a point.
He does. He absolutely has a point, Mr. Speaker, and I acknowledge his point, and I acknowledge again to those watching how skin thin he is. But again, back to the leader of the opposition who lives in a mansion of sorts, and we talk about transparency and accountability and the ability to come down to the truth. The truth, Mr. Chair, that the member opposite doing his Perry Mason reboot, the truth must be known. And yet he will not take a security clearance. His own leader of his own party will not get clear security clearance to get to the truth, or at least be made aware of exactly what is being taken place. So let's secure now the motion at hand. So here we have an allegations being made by the Conservatives that this decision was done in quick order. And it wasn't, Mr. Speaker. We already know from the previous testimonies by the officials that this has been ongoing for over 10 years. The Conservative members, their Conservative appointees, the ones that were there prior to the Liberal appointments, they themselves said that the residence was not up to snuff, that they didn't have the specifications required. They already acknowledged that the residence was in need of repair and, for that matter, of a new residence. So this is not new. There's no revelation here. And the notion that somehow a temporary appointment to the Consul General of New York is going to somehow make the decision. Well, we often hear people's opinions. My goodness, we're hearing a lot of opinions right now from the opposite side, and they're free to express them. But, Mr. Chair, that doesn't make them the decision maker. The Consul General is not the decision maker of this transaction. And if anybody wants to make opinions, and certainly the Conservatives have made many opinions about that residence prior to Tom Clark, like this is nothing new. So the fact of the matter is the decision to make that transaction and a transaction which is $7 million less. Like they're moving the residence to a property at $7 million less than what it is now. And we still hold the asset value. We still have the asset appreciation of the former resident in hand still. And they're making it for the net benefit of Canadians. We already know that it's going to save ultimately taxpayers up to $7 million. We already know by testimony and by the rigorous procedures in place over many years from the various agencies that it was independent, it was rigorous, and it was followed through the rules. The essence of who's residing there and the people involved who utilize those residents, including many Conservatives, I may add, didn't come to be part of that decision. They did not follow through in that transaction. That was very much done by the experts and the officials within government. That's already acknowledged and understood. And lastly, the relationship with the United States is critical. And one of the most important residences in the United States by Canada is the one in Manhattan. It is, in fact, critical to its well-being. The ones in LA are important. The ones in Washington are important. The ability for Canada to be well represented in the international stage is critical. And when you look at who else is residing around the system, ours does not anywhere come close to the same degree of value as some other residences. But what is really important is the ability for Canadians to transact, to have meetings, to enable us to cooperate with U.S. and other international states within that residence for the benefit of all Canadians. But it leads to economic growth, it leads to job creation, it leads to economic well-being for Canada, and it has proven to be so. And other levels of government use it too, other conservative levels of government. So the allegation, the notion that this Consul General somehow had a role in making a decision, regardless, the decision isn't his, right? That's understood. And the timing wasn't short. So all that to say, Mr. Chair, we do not need to fill time. Let's let you guys talk and fill your egos all you wish.
Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Backrack, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and it's good to be back at OGO, dealing with a familiar topic. This morning, I'm in British Columbia, and I woke up very early for some commitments on Eastern time and rolled over. And at the risk of giving them free promotion, I read Politico's email newsletter, and this story jumped out at me because I remember very distinctly the testimony, the vehement testimony of Mr. Clark before this committee, and reading the revelations in that newsletter about the role that Mr. Clark actually played, which has now become public through freedom of information. I was struck by the stark contrast between what he told this committee and the role that he actually played. Now, maybe I have a little bit different perspective on this than some other members around the table. I listened to all the testimony from officials about the old residents and the new residents, and I don't actually know, based on all that testimony, I don't know if the old residence isn't suitable. The one thing that stood out to me was the concern around accessibility and the fact that a person using a wheelchair would have a very difficult time accessing the old residence. And I think that's a concern that should be taken very seriously. But obviously there were enough people that had voiced concerns about the suitability of the residence that, I'm not going to deny that those concerns weren't valid. I also don't know whether the new residence was a good deal or not, or whether it's more suitable and rectifies the shortcomings of the old residence. I don't actually think that's germane to the debate that we're having today, despite that being the focus of my Liberal colleagues' interventions. I'll also speak briefly to the opulence of either residence, and I think if you visited the residence of any of our peer nations, they would be equally opulent. I think it's a feature of these sorts of properties that are used to entertain and used in a diplomatic way, and that just is what it is. I don't think anyone is suggesting that the Consul General's residence should be in the suburbs in a modest 3-bedroom home. I don't think that's what's being asserted. What really irks me is the fact that the Consul General was so clear in response to repeated questioning at committee. And I didn't have a lot of time in preparing for this, but I pulled up some of the evidence from that meeting and read his words, which are quite clear here. And I'll just read a couple of passages to, I suppose, restate just how clear it was. He stated, this is Mr. Clark, "As you have already heard in testimony from global affairs officials, I had no role whatsoever in either deciding to sell the former residence or buying the new one. That was completely undertaken in the Property Bureau in Ottawa, by the Property Bureau in Ottawa. I was not involved in the selection of the new property, its amenities, or its location. As you have heard, this project will return millions, blah, blah, blah." Moving on, he says, "I was not involved in any way, shape, or form in the decision to buy this new residence or sell the old residence." And then Mr. Johari asked, "Did you at any time talk to anyone regarding a desire for relocation?" Mr. Clark says, "Never." One word answer, never. You can't get more unequivocal than that. And then looking, turning back to the reporting that came out this morning, it's very clear that he was extremely involved in expressing concerns about the suitability of the old residence. The current Consulate General, New York, head of mission, expressed concerns regarding the completion of the kitchen and the refurbishment project and indicated the unit was not suitable to be the accommodations, and it does not have an ideal floor plan for representational activities. That very well may be true. That may be a very valid thing, and it actually may be a valid thing for the Consul General to express, because after all, he is tasked with doing a job, and what he's essentially saying is that the tools that I've been given to do this job are, in my view, inadequate. Is that an appropriate role for the Consul General? I'm not sure, but that's what he said. What's the real problem here is that then he came to committee and said that he had absolutely no role and that he had never expressed concerns about the old residents. And, I think that's a pretty stark and troubling revelation that someone of his stature, someone with his experience, both as a journalist and as a diplomat, would come before the committee and misrepresent and seemingly mislead the committee with regard to his role. I think that's something that all Canadians should be concerned about, and that's why I'll be supporting the Conservatives' motion to bring Mr. Clark back to committee and to answer for the stark contrast between his remarks and the revelations contained in the documents that are now public. So with that, Mr. Chair, I'll turn it back to you, and I hope we can get to a vote on this before too long. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bachrach. We'll go to Mrs. Block, and then we have Mrs. Cusi, Mr. Brock, and then Mrs. Vignola.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I do want to follow up on Mr. Bachrach's comments and his observations. I think they are spot on, and that what is at issue here is the testimony of Mr. Clark and what he described as his vehement testimony. And he's read the comments that were made by Mr. Clark when he attended this committee. And then there's the testimony of Emily Nicholson. And we can all remember her vehement testimony that the first email and the second email were not, she was not backing off of her first email, but that she was actually trying to insist that Mr. Clark had no part to play whatsoever, that he wasn't instrumental. And now we know, after seeing the information that was released through an ATIP, that in fact, Tom Clark had notified Global Affairs that the previous official residence was not suitable and had expressed concerns over completing renovations. We know that this information that was received through an ATIP contradicts what he told us on September 12th. And again, I would have to echo my colleague's comments about vehement testimony. In fact, I think if you will recall, my colleague, Mr. Brock, during his questioning, made a point of asking if Mr. Clark had made any comments at all when he toured the new residence. And we were led to believe, or left with the impression, that neither he nor the real estate said anything at all during that tour, which further speaks to the fact that we were misled by Mr. Clark and departmental officials in the testimony that they provided to this committee. And I would just want to encourage all members that this is what the issue is. Committee has been misled by witnesses on the facts around the decision to purchase this apartment and what Mr. Clark's involvement was. And so I just want to encourage all members to stay focused on what this motion is actually calling for. I know you'd like to take us all back into the weeds of the history around the purchasing of this apartment, but what we are here discussing today is the fact that Mr. Clark misled this committee. Thank you.
Thank you. I have Mr. Brock.
Chair, I intend on keeping my second intervention rather focused and brief. I thank Mr. Backrack and my colleague Ms. Block for their comments. I will heartily agree with everything that was said. But in response to one of the Liberal members, I'm not sure exactly where this came from. It could have been Mr. Jawari or Mr. Souza. I want to remind members from several months ago when we had the selling and I believe the listing real estate agents from Manhattan who testified via Zoom. And I put to them, because I was able to pull, just through a very simple Google search, pull the actual listing of 550 Park Avenue, Unit 12E. And I want to read this into the record, and I'll make some brief commentary. Under the words description, high floor, golden age masterpiece. Introducing Unit 12E at 550 Park Avenue, a high-floor residence in one of Lenox Hill's premier pre-war co-ops. A perfect example of the grand golden age apartments of the 1920s. This J.E.R. Carpenter masterpiece is full of volume, scale, and ideal circulation. A great room with 11-foot ceilings and large windows that frame exposures to the north and east invite you into the heart of the home, while the adjacent dining room could comfortably host down a dinner of 18. Designed for hospitality, a commercial kitchen and butler's pantry are further complemented by direct access to a separate staff office and storage room, as well as the in-unit laundry, a den library just off the entrance gallery, as well as a powder room complete the northern wing. Along the southern corridor, 4 bedrooms, all with ensuite bathrooms and walk-in closets, and 2 with corner exposures offer privacy, comfort. With its high ceilings, large windows, herringbone walnut floors, and ample storage throughout, this residence offers the perfect framework for generational living and is truly a space to behold. 3,800 square feet, 12 rooms, 5 beds, 4.5 baths. Now, according to Tom Clark, within 2 months of his post, this example I've just provided committee members wasn't suitable for hosting, let alone living. When I asked the listing agent whether or not, in his opinion, this description constituted a fixer-upper, because the government will have you believe this unit required over $2 million in renovations. No one has given us an itemized list of what needed to be renovated. No one has given us a cost projective. No one has given us any information other than a GAC official who confirmed that it wasn't compliant in terms of wheelchair access to a bathroom. The entranceway needed to be widened. That is the only evidence that this committee has heard of any so-called $2 million worth of renovations. So I wish to put that on the record, because clearly there are more questions than there are answers. And the only way we get to the bottom of Tom Clark's involvement, his true involvement, is to recall him with full cross-examination. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I have Mrs. Vignola, then Mr. Kuzmierczuk.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When we saw Mr. Clark for a few hours before this committee, before the fact that he omitted certain information, he lied, whatever we want to say, I think that's quite concerning. As far as the residents of 555 12E Park Avenue, I would like to remind you that not only was it an issue of widening the door to the bathroom to allow access to wheelchairs, but also it was the electrical and heating system that was problematic, especially when you consider the building was constructed in 1917. So simply widening the door shouldn't cost 2.6 billion, and heating, well, there is some central heating available. This house normally has some meters, so that's what I would think. So 2.6 million, that's a lot of money. Was this council the only one who raised issues with the building? I don't think so. I think the idea of refurbishing was raised since 2014. I think the apartment was already 97 years old. I think currently it's 107, if I'm not mistaken in my math. So 2 years just to hear, oh, I forgot that aspect, or I said, I don't know, there are problems with the heating, electricity. It's intermittent. So is 2 years necessary? I would propose to my colleagues to reduce it to 1 hour, 2 turns. I think that would be quite sufficient to know if he'd like to also not to have some additional information on renovations that he would have liked to see in the building. It's good to see 12, 11 feet ceilings. It seems that the building was crumbling. Right now it's magnificent. So we can look at issues where the description seems quite exaggerated. Well, I can't have access to 12 feet ceilings and the marble floors. I have a building from 1908 which needs serious renovation. So all those figures are impressive, but beyond these impressive descriptions, that is the bread and butter of the real estate agents. Do we have a building that could be problematic? That's what we could raise. Do we need 2 hours to look into that? Maybe 4, 5, or 6 rounds of questioning to do that. I have some doubts on that. So I would propose an amendment to the motion asking that there are 2 rounds of questioning, that Mr. Clark should be present for 2 rounds of questioning instead of 2 hours.
Clarify an amendment, just changed it to 1, basically 1 hour, 2 rounds, which is 3 interventions. Okay. So the amendment is just changed it basically to 1 hour, similar to what we had this morning with the minister. So we'll start a speaking order on the amendment.
In favor.
Speaking order.
Spoke.
Anyone wish to speak on it, or can we go right to a vote on the amendment?
It's pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm seeing nods around. Are we fine with the amendment?
Merci.
Great. So we'll consider that passed and amended. We're now back to the amended motion, which is the same, basically changing it out to 1 hour. I had Mr. Kusmirchuk and Mr. Kusa, or Mrs. Kusi, then Mr. Sousa.
Obviously, today is a big election with our American friends and neighbors, and so I think it's appropriate to quote former President Harry Truman, who addressed Canadian Parliament in Ottawa on June 11th, 1947, and he said, quote, "Canadian-American relations for many years did not develop spontaneously. The example of accord provided by our two countries did not come about merely through the happy circumstance of geography. It is compounded on 1 part proximity and 9 parts goodwill and common sense." The common sense has gone out of the Conservative Party when I look at the discussions that we've had here around the table. This transaction is saving Canadian taxpayers $7.4 million. $7.4 million are being saved. Every year, the cost of the new residence saves Canadian taxpayers $115,000 per month. And because we knew that the old residence required major renovations, moving to the new residence saves taxpayers about $2.6 million in renovations. And so again, the new residence is smaller and it is less expensive, and it saves taxpayers $7.4 million. In addition to that, it is the residence of the Consulate General on average hosts about 50 important meetings within every 2 years. This new residence, not only is it cheaper, not only is it saving taxpayers $7.4 million, but it's more effective for hosting meetings, roundtables, discussions, events, and it is more accessible. It is more accessible to more people. In addition to saving taxpayers $7.4 million, the process, we've heard from the very beginning, the process was independent and the process was rigorous. 21 properties had been appraised, and the residence that was selected was pretty much the least costly of all 21 properties that had been examined. About 100-page analysis was conducted on the property by officials independent of any political elected officials. And the third point, and this is the important point, and it goes back to President Truman's quote, and it goes back to the testimony we heard from Minister Joly today, strengthens. This is an investment that strengthens the most important bilateral relationship that Canada has, and that is the relationship with our friends and neighbors in the United States. That consulate office nurtures and grows $200 billion worth of trade between our two countries, including 5 U.S. states. And the impact that it has, I mean, that is a huge number. But it's important to break it down because that trade, that relationship impacts all of our communities. All the communities that we represent around this table are impacted. And I look at my community in Windsor, Essex, and I look at the fact that we landed a battery plant, an EV battery plant that has already created 2,000 jobs for local Canadian workers building the plant, and that will create 2,500 full-time, unionized, local jobs for local Canadian workers. Hundreds already have been hired and are being trained as we speak to build batteries. The first battery came off the battery line just 2 weeks ago. And the majority of those batteries, the destination, will be in factories in the United States. We have in Windsor, Essex, the largest tool and die sector cluster in all of North America. And again, 90% of what we manufacture, where does it go? It goes to the United States. It goes to the United States. It's your number one client or number one destination. Those are jobs that we're talking about here. Those are jobs. They are real people that rely upon us strengthening relationship with our American partners. And what we're hearing from the Conservatives is they want to do that relationship on the cheap. They want to underinvest in our relationship with the United States, which is exactly what they've done over and over when they gutted the Defense Department. I mean, 5 years of consecutive cuts.
Excuse me, Mr. Kusmirchuk. Mrs. Block?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to call relevance on Mr. Kushmirchuk's intervention. I believe we're to be discussing the amended motion at hand. I would just call relevance.
Thanks. If you can get to the motion at hand.
This is a pattern. What we've heard around this table is a pattern of the Conservatives under-investing in the most important relationship that Canada has, and that's the relationship with the United States.
Mr. Brock?
Completely
please.
irrelevant to the motion at hand.
Totally relevant.
We could come back to the motion.
It's totally relevant.
The discussion that we've had around this table for weeks now on this issue, and I've heard time and time again, is the Conservatives wanting to underinvest.
Mrs. Block?
Again, relevance. What does that have to do with the amended motion at hand?
We always do allow wide latitude, but please, Mr. Kusmirchuk, get to the motion.
We are talking about the purchase of a consulate residence in New York that is saving taxpayers $7.4 million, a process that was independent and rigorous, and a consulate and a residence that is, we've heard from testimony after testimony, is absolutely essential to the strengthening of the Canada-US relationship. That is the relevance. And that relationship may not be relevant to you. It is certainly relevant to the residents in border communities like mine.
Mr. Brock.
No one from the Conservative side, or in fact anyone in this committee, is challenging the importance of a relationship between Canada and the United States. It goes without saying. It's not relevant what my friend is saying now, because he's not speaking at all about the necessity of recalling Tom Clark, okay, in light of contradictory evidence. That's what we need to hear from.
Mr. Kusmirchuk, I have to insist you actually get to discussing the motion. Otherwise, there are other people on the list, including Mr. Sousa, who I'm sure can.
And again, the importance is about an investment in consulate operations. That's the relevance. We're talking about investment in consulate operations that are vital to the US-Canada relationship. That may not be relevant to my Conservative colleagues, sure as hell is to residents in my community in Windsor, Essex, and border communities in Canada that rely on a strong US-Canada relationship. And as I mentioned, 90% of what tool and die shops in my community manufacture go to the United States.
Point of order, Chair. How long do we need to listen to a member who is not getting to the point with an amended motion on the table? How many times do members have to call relevance before he gets to the point?
There are rules around this. I think it is 3, but Mr. Kuzmierczak, I have to insist that you get to the motion. It's a very straightforward one. There are other people from your party, I'm sure, who can take up the baton if you're not able to address the motion. But if you could please get to the specific motion.
That's not a rule. So I've mentioned that my point is that we've had copious meetings on this issue. So the relevance of this is that the Conservatives are calling on additional extended meetings on this issue. And the point that I'm trying to make is that the facts are abundantly clear that this transaction is saving Canadians $7.4 million, that the process is independent and rigorous, and that it is strengthening investment in the consulate, is strengthening U.S.-Canada relationships. And what we heard, the reason I'm talking about my Conservative colleagues wanting to do foreign policy on the cheap, just like they wanted to do defense spending on the cheap, 5 years of defense cuts, 5 years, is we heard around this table from my Conservative colleagues that we should be locating our consulate in New Jersey.
Mrs. Block?
The motion is about recalling a witness that misled this committee. I would ask that this member either get back to that motion or, as you've suggested, hand it over to someone else. I'm calling relevance.
Yeah, thanks. I think we've reached the point where you haven't got to that, so we will move to the next speaker, which is Mrs. Kusi.
Mr. Chair, that is patently unfair. There have been.
I can refer the issue to the clerk who will rule on it. I understand we do
Mr.
give
Chair?
wide latitude, but we do
This
reach
is
a
patently
point
unfair.
where it's a very specific motion. Again, we do give wide latitude, but it's such a very specific motion that you haven't addressed. And I've
Mr. Chair,
5
on that point
interventions.
of order,
Yes, Mr.
could
Becker.
I just speak to the point of order and offer my brief thoughts?
Yes.
My sense is that the argument that my colleague, Mr. Kuzmierczak, is making is that the ends justify the means. So I would suggest that it's relevant if that it's indeed the argument that he's making. The means in this case include misleading the committee, and that's the issue that I have with how things have transpired. But if he's restating the importance of diplomatic relations and the importance of a new residence, he's basically saying that no matter how we got here, it doesn't really matter because this is so important. So I would support allowing him to continue to speak if that is indeed the argument he's making.
Thanks. I think we've reached a point where 5 times I've asked. I can ask the clerk to weigh in as well on the rules and such. If you will get back, we'll allow you back on the speaking slot, but 5 times I've asked specifically. But okay. Mrs. Kusi and then Mr. Sousa.
I believe my Conservative colleagues covered my points. I'll cede my time. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thanks. Mr. Sousa. Sorry, and then Mr. Backrack.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So a lot of deliberation is being made over motivations of this transaction, somehow the engagement of an individual who does not make the decision. And that individual has stated clearly that he was not involved in the transaction nor in the decision-making of this process. Members opposite are making allegations that somehow within a 2-month period that individual became Consul General, he was able to make a transaction which he said he didn't involve himself part of. And it's nothing that is new, given the testimony that this has been ongoing for decades now, that the property needed to be revamped or relocated. And consequently, a savings of $7.4 million is being had in moving the residents or moving to a new residence at a lesser cost and providing more efficiencies. So again, people can have opinions, but that doesn't make them the decision maker, and that's evident here. The Consul General also confirmed that the decision is made by the experts, that they rely on the relative agencies and individuals involved in the respective agencies to fulfill their mandate to find and locate the proper properties and go through the transactions as necessary. the savings on the property is paramount, is critical to the tune of 7.4 million and $2.6 million in renovations that do not have to be made as a result. The valuation of the property continues because they still have the asset. Being the opposition are somehow conflating the issue that they need cash in hand, but the asset value exists, and the potential sale is going to net benefit Canadians in a big way. But the independence of this transaction has also been made clear, that many properties were reviewed. Over 21, I believe, properties were considered.
I have to interrupt you, and I do apologize, but that is it for our resources. We are adjourning.